Okay, let's start. Number 1. The Grand Canyon Vault. You're reading the front page of the Arizona Gazette, and a man named G.E. Kincaid is describing an underground vault carved into the walls of the Grand Canyon, statues that look Egyptian, hieroglyphics cut into the rock, mummified remains stacked in sealed chambers, wrapped the way you'd expect out of the Valley of the Kings, except this is Arizona, and nobody has ever explained how any of it got there. Kincaid says he found the vault alone, drifting the river in a wooden boat, spotting an opening in the canyon wall about 1,486 feet down from the rim. He says he climbed in with nothing but a flashlight and found room after room of the same design. Shafts cut deliberately into stone, copper implements, water urns, and what he describes as a shrine holding a cross-legged statue that looks nothing like anything Native American cultures in the region are known to have made. He says a man named Professor S.A. Jordan came out afterward, sent by the Smithsonian Institution, to help excavate it properly. The Gazette runs the story straight, no disclaimer, no hedge, right there on the front page next to the regular news of the day. Readers believe it. Why wouldn't they? The Smithsonian's name is sitting right there in print, attached to a real federal agency people trusted to know the difference between a discovery and a tall tale. And then, nothing. No follow-up story ever runs, no expedition report ever gets filed, and no Professor Jordan turns up on any staff roster the Smithsonian has ever produced, not in 1909 and not since. But the silence didn't stay quiet forever, and that's the part most people never hear about. More than a century later, people are still asking the Smithsonian directly whether this happened, and the institution has had to answer. Its own Department of Anthropology put it in writing. They searched their files and found no mention of a Professor Jordan, no Kincaid, and no lost Egyptian civilization in Arizona. Think about what that actually means. An institution that keeps over 100 years of its own excavation paperwork had to issue a formal statement saying this specific thing, according to their own records, never happened. That denial is the reason the story refuses to die. A hoax that gets ignored fades on its own. This one got answered, by name, by the exact organization it claimed was involved. Nobody has ever identified who Kincaid actually was. No birth record. No other article carrying his byline anywhere else in the historical record. No photograph. A man who supposedly worked alongside a federal institution simply does not exist anywhere outside this one newspaper page. Researchers have tried for decades to run him down anyway, treating it as a genuine historical puzzle rather than a rumor to wave off. County records, ship manifests, census rolls from that stretch of Arizona in 1909, none of it turns up a Kincaid who matches. That's not proof the vault was real. If anything, it points the other way, toward a byline invented for a story built to sell copies during a slow news week. But it does mean the one detail that could settle this instantly, a real person to ask, was never available to check. The story got built specifically so nobody could ever run it down, and whether that was clever fiction or a cover for something the Gazette's editor half believed, nobody alive can say for certain. Historians call it a hoax, and most of the evidence agrees with them. No cave matching Kincaid's description has ever turned up in a full century of Grand Canyon mapping and river surveys, and the Gazette printed other tall tales that same era to sell papers the same way plenty of frontier newsrooms did. But two things are still true at once. The 1909 article is real. It sits in newspaper archives right now, dated, printed, footnoted by historians who've tracked it down page by page. And the Smithsonian's denial is real too, on the record, in writing, answering a question nobody should have had to ask twice, over a century after the paper hit newsstands. Somewhere between a con man's story and an institution's official no, there's a gap nobody has ever closed. And it turns out that gap isn't unique to the Grand Canyon. The Smithsonian has its own paper trail from the exact same era, and this one, it wrote itself, on purpose, as an official government record. Number 2. The Kanawha Valley Giant. You're P.W. Norris, a field agent working for the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, and you're standing in a mound in the Kanawha Valley, West Virginia, watching a burial come out of the dirt the way it's lain for thousands of years. You measure it the way you measure every skeleton on this survey, bone by bone, laying a tape along the femur, the tibia, the spine, the same routine you've run dozens of times already this season. And you write the number down in your field notes exactly as you found it. 7 feet 6 inches, tip to toe, 19 inches across the shoulders. That's not a typo, by the way. 19 inches, exactly as Norris wrote it down in the field. Norris wasn't guessing, and he wasn't writing for a newspaper trying to sell copies. He was a paid government surveyor filling out a technical report that would eventually run 700 pages, published by the Smithsonian itself in 1894 as the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, under the direction of an archaeologist named Cyrus Thomas. And Norris's Kanawha Valley skeleton isn't the only one in it. Thomas logs a second oversized burial himself, this time in a mound in Rowan County, Tennessee, measured from the base of the skull down through the leg bones at 7 feet 3 inches. Two separate sites, two separate surveyors, the same institution, the same official government publication, both describing skeletons well outside the normal human range. Most of the other burials Thomas and his agents cataloged that decade run completely ordinary, unremarkable heights nobody would ever look at twice. That's actually part of what makes these two entries stand out. They aren't buried in a report full of exaggerated measurements. They sit surrounded by hundreds of unremarkable ones, which is exactly the pattern you'd expect from a careful surveyor recording what was actually in front of him. This report was never trying to do what people now use it for. It wasn't hunting for giants. Thomas ran field agents like Norris across more than 2,000 mound sites spread across 21 states, from Ohio and West Virginia down through Tennessee and the Gulf states, and the whole survey was built to settle a different argument completely. Whether the mounds were built by the ancestors of Native American tribes or by some separate vanished mound builder race, a popular 19th century theory that Thomas spent all 700 pages methodically dismantling with real archaeological evidence, site by site. The oversized measurements sit as a minor footnote inside a 700-page document, mostly arguing against exactly the kind of exotic origin story people use them to support today. So what happened to the actual bones? It's not a comfortable question. Mound excavation in the 1880s didn't work the way it does today, with GPS coordinates and individually bagged, barcoded specimens. Skeletons went into cloth-lined crates, got shipped to Washington by rail over the course of weeks, and were folded into a bulk collection that, by the Smithsonian's own admission, was never cataloged specimen by specimen the way a modern accession would be. There is no drawer today labeled Kanawha Valley, 7 feet 6 inches, with a number you could walk up and check. The measurement exists exactly once, in Norris's handwriting, printed in Thomas's report, and nowhere else. Nobody stole those bones or hid them in a secret vault to keep the truth from you, and no conspiracy meeting decided to make them disappear. That part of the story is folklore, and it's worth saying plainly, the same way it was worth saying about the Grand Canyon vault a few minutes ago. But it's also true that the actual physical evidence behind two of the strangest numbers in Smithsonian history cannot be pulled out and remeasured today, by anyone, for any reason, because the paperwork that would locate them inside a bulk 19th century collection simply doesn't exist. The real question is what happened to the thousands of other bones from that same decade of digging across 21 states, shipped east in crates, logged once in a field notebook, and never individually tracked again once they reached Washington. The claim survives, the proof doesn't, and once you notice that gap in one government report, you start finding it in newspaper after newspaper from that exact same decade, printed in towns that had never heard of Cyrus Thomas and never read a word of his survey. Number 3. The Ohio Vault Skeletons. You're a reader in New York City, opening the New York Times over breakfast, scanning past the shipping notices and the market report, and there's a small item date-lined Centerburg, Ohio. Diggers working a stone-lined vault inside a burial mound have just pulled out 4 skeletons. 3 of them measure over 7 feet. The 4th comes in at a full 8 feet, laid out in a chamber built from fitted stone slabs, not the loose dirt burial you'd expect from a simple grave. Somebody had gone to real trouble to build that vault, for these specific bodies. 7 years later, almost to the day, a different paper, the Ironton Register, out of southern Ohio, runs its own account, dated May 5, 1892, this time from a mound near Proctorville, a small town along the Ohio River. Diggers there pull a skull with a jaw noticeably larger than a normal adult's, and a detail that shows up nowhere else on this list, teeth described as double-rowed, an extra ridge of them behind the front set. Different county, different decade, different reporters who almost certainly never read each other's work, and yet the same basic shape of story keeps surfacing across the Ohio Valley through the entire back half of the 1800s. And it's not just these two. A separate account from Arkansas County, Arkansas, describes a skeleton pulled from the Chickasawba Mound at 8 or 9 feet. Same basic story, different state entirely, no connection to either Ohio paper. Different towns, different burial styles, the same recurring claim of skeletons well outside the ordinary range coming out of local earthworks, cropping up again and again with no coordination between any of the reporters involved. If you're enjoying digging into this one as much as I am, go ahead and subscribe. We've still got 7 more of these, and the paper trail only gets thicker from here. The honest problem with all of it is straightforward. Not one of these specific skeletons survives today in any museum, university collection, or archive you could walk into and examine. The vault at Centerburg, the double-rowed jaw at Proctorville, the Chickasaw bones out of Arkansas, none of it was preserved the way a modern excavation would preserve it. Bones from small-town mound digs in the 1880s and 1890s routinely got reburied on the spot once the crowd lost interest, sold off piece by piece as curiosities to whoever showed up with cash, broken apart entirely by souvenir hunters, chipping off a rib or a finger bone to take home, or simply left stacked in a shed to weather once the newspaper story had run its course. Local museums that might have preserved them often didn't exist yet in these towns. What we're left with, in almost every case, is print, dated, named, real print, sitting in an archive somebody can still pull up today, but print all the same. That cuts both ways, and it's worth being straight about which way. It means nobody today can put a tape measure on these bones and settle the question for good, which is exactly the kind of gap that keeps a story alive long after it should have faded. But it also means every single one of these accounts ran through the exact same unreliable machine, local reporters competing for readers in a crowded market, working before any standard for verifying an archaeological claim existed, in an era when a good story sold papers whether or not anyone ever double-checked the measuring tape, and no editor was fact-checking a mound dig 2 counties over before the presses ran. So which is it? Real skeletons an unprepared 19th century public genuinely didn't know how to process, or a media environment that rewarded exaggeration until exaggeration became the local reporting standard? The honest answer is probably both, in different proportions in different towns, and there's no way left to sort out which report belongs to which explanation. What's not in question is that the pattern was real, that it ran for decades across multiple states, and that the public appetite behind it was strong enough to sell papers every single time a new one ran. And that appetite didn't go unnoticed. At least one man figured out you could build the exact same headline on purpose, for money, bury the evidence yourself ahead of time, and pull off the whole thing without digging up a single real bone. Number 4. The Cardiff Giant. You're a farmhand digging a new well on William Newell's property outside Cardiff, New York, and your shovel hits stone about 3 feet down, and the stone has an unmistakable shape to it. You keep digging and a face comes up out of the dirt, then a shoulder, then an entire body, 10 feet long, carved in unmistakably human form, lying on its back like it had been resting there since before recorded history. Word spreads through Cardiff within hours. By the next day there's a line down the road, and Newell is charging 50 cents a head just to look at it. Nobody watching that crowd knew the one detail that actually mattered. A full year earlier, Newell's cousin, a Binghamton cigar maker named George Hull, had ordered a 5-ton block of gypsum shipped from Iowa, hired a stonecutter in Chicago to carve it into the shape of a man, aged the surface with sand, ink, and acid to fake centuries of weathering, and buried it on Newell's farm himself, in the exact spot the well diggers would eventually strike it. Hull's motive traces back to an argument with a traveling revivalist preacher who'd insisted, as scripture, that giants once walked the earth. Hull decided to build one and watch people believe it. And people believed it completely. Geologists, ministers, and curious crowds all filed past the petrified man and argued in print over what it actually was: a fossil, a statue, or genuine physical proof of biblical giants walking among ancient humans. Not everyone was fooled. Yale paleontologist Othniel C. Marsh examined it in person and called it, on the record, a most decided humbug, pointing out fresh tool marks along the surface that had no business being on something claiming to be ancient. His assessment ran in the same papers as the believers' theories, side by side, and the crowds kept paying anyway. P.T. Barnum, already the most famous showman in the country, offered $60,000 just to lease the giant for 3 months and put it in front of his own paying crowds. The offer got turned down. That was only round 1, because Barnum's response wasn't to walk away. Barnum built his own plaster copy from memory and a handful of sketches, put it on display in New York City just a short train ride from where the original was still drawing crowds, and marketed his fake as the authentic giant, calling the actual buried and dug-up original the fake. Two hoaxes now competing for the same audience, each calling the other one the lie, and paying customers lined up for both versions with no way to tell which one, if either, deserved their 50 cents. And somehow, it gets worse. Neither exhibit ever had to prove anything to keep drawing a crowd, because people kept paying to see both anyway. The whole thing came apart a little over a year after Hull first buried the block, on December 10, 1869, when he walked into a newspaper office and confessed everything: the gypsum block, the Chicago stonecutter, the acid bath, the year of waiting underground, start to finish, in his own words. No lawsuit forced it out of him, no rival exposed him first. He told the story himself, once the money had already been made and the argument had run its course long enough to satisfy him. The original Cardiff Giant survives today, on permanent display at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York. It stands there now as a monument to exactly how thoroughly a confident story, wrapped around a genuine cultural argument people already wanted to have, can outrun the actual evidence. Add it all up before we move on. A 10-foot stone man, a Barnum knockoff of the Stone Man, a genuine credentialed scientist calling it fake in print at the time, and a public argument that still ran for months in respected newspapers anyway. Every part of it, every single piece, was fake from the very first shovel of dirt, and none of the geologists, the ministers, or the crowds settled the debate. The debate only ended once the manufacturer himself walked into that newspaper office and confessed. If a story built entirely from nothing could hold an entire region's attention for that long, it raises an uncomfortable question about the other cases on this list that were never confessed to, never fully investigated, and never confirmed either way. Proving one giant was manufactured doesn't tell you anything about the skulls a real, credentialed archaeologist pulled out of the ground in South America 60 years later, and those don't come with anyone's signed confession attached. Number 5. The Paracas Skulls. You're Julio Tello, a Peruvian archaeologist, and you've just opened a necropolis on the Paracas Peninsula, a stretch of desert coastline south of Lima. Inside, wrapped in layers of textile, you find skull after skull after skull, and none of them look like an ordinary human head. The brain case stretches back and up, elongated well beyond anything a normal skull does, some of them with a cranial capacity measured well above the typical human average. By the time the count is finished, cataloging skull after skull from tomb after tomb across the necropolis, Tello has documented more than 300 of them, dated to roughly 3,000 years old, one of the largest concentrations of altered skulls found anywhere on the planet. Let's be precise about where these actually are, because this matters. They're not at the Smithsonian, they never have been. The bulk of the Paracas collection sits today at the privately run Paracas History Museum and at the Ica Regional Museum in Peru, curated by Peruvian institutions on Peruvian soil. If you've heard this story with the Smithsonian's name attached to it, that's not the version the actual museum records support. The mainstream explanation is a real, well-documented practice: intentional cranial binding. Cultures across the ancient world, from the Andes to parts of Africa to the Pacific Northwest, wrapped infant skulls in cloth or bound them between boards while the bone was still soft, deliberately reshaping the head as it grew, sometimes over a period of years, tightening the wraps as the child got older. It doesn't hurt the child in any way, researchers have found, and it doesn't change what's inside the skull, only the shape of the bone itself as it hardens around the binding. Archaeologists have documented the exact wrapping technique the Paracas culture used, matched it against the surviving textile fragments buried alongside the skulls, and it accounts for the elongation you see in the vast majority of these 300-plus specimens. There's one more wrinkle worth knowing before the DNA story, because it's the part that actually holds up. A handful of the Paracas skulls have cranial capacities measured well above the typical human average, large enough that some physical anthropologists have called them genuinely unusual, even accounting for artificial deformation. That measurement is real, peer-reviewed, and still discussed in physical anthropology circles today. It doesn't require an origin story to be worth noting. It's just a documented outlier inside an already unusual population of skulls. But the version you've heard is probably not that one. In 2014, a writer named Brian Forster, who has no formal training in genetics, publicized mitochondrial DNA test results, claiming some Paracas skulls carried mutations unlike anything in known human, Neanderthal, or Denisovan DNA. The claim spread fast online, but it never ran through peer review, and it was never published in an actual scientific journal where other geneticists could check the methodology. When Forster later commissioned additional lab work on his own samples, the results reportedly came back as ordinary human mitochondrial haplotypes. Mainstream geneticists point to a much less dramatic explanation for any earlier anomalous readings. These skulls have been handled by tourists, researchers, and museum staff for close to a century without cleanroom DNA protocols, passed hand to hand, photographed, touched, sometimes even worn for pictures, and contamination from modern human DNA is exactly the kind of thing that produces results that look strange until somebody runs the test properly in a controlled lab with a chain of custody that can actually be verified. So here's where that leaves the Paracas skulls. The elongation is real, extreme, and genuinely one of a kind at this scale. The cause is documented and it's cranial binding, not ancestry. And the non-human DNA claim that most people have actually heard, the one that gets clipped into short videos and screenshots without any of this context attached, is unpublished, uncredentialed, and hasn't survived its own follow-up testing. That doesn't make the skulls any less strange to look at. It just means the strangeness is in the scale of the deformation itself. 3,000 years of a culture deliberately reshaping its children's heads into something that doesn't look human anymore. What it does share with everything else on this list is the pattern. A real, documented find, a mainstream explanation that mostly holds up, and one thread that never got a clean resolution either way. The next case on this list has that same structure, except this time somebody finally ran the DNA test properly, under a federal court order, and it took 20 years to get an answer. Number 6. Kennewick Man. You're one of 2 college students wading along the shallows of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, during a hydroplane race, and your foot bumps something solid in the mud. You reach down and pull up a human skull. You call it in, and within days a nearly complete skeleton comes out of the riverbank, one of the most intact ancient skeletons ever found in North America, missing almost nothing a forensic anthropologist would need for a full examination. Radiocarbon dating puts him somewhere between 8,400 and 9,000 years old, meaning this man walked along that same river roughly 4,000 years before the pyramids at Giza were built, back when the entire Columbia Plateau looked almost nothing like it does today. Forensic anthropologist James Chatters gets the first real look at the bones, and his initial assessment lands like a bomb. He describes the skull as caucasoid, a long, narrow brain case, a projecting nose, features that don't match the broader, shorter cranial shape typical of more recent Native American populations in the region. The label spreads through the press almost immediately, and it does exactly what you'd expect a word like that to do to a 9,000-year-old skeleton found in the Pacific Northwest. It turns a scientific puzzle into a headline about who was really here first. Within weeks, 5 Columbia Plateau tribes petitioned for immediate reburial under federal repatriation law, arguing the remains are unquestionably their ancestor and belong back in the ground immediately. 8 scientists sue instead, wanting the chance to study the skeleton before it's reburied permanently, and any answer becomes impossible to get. That lawsuit, Bonnickson versus United States, drags through federal court for the better part of a decade before the scientists finally win the right to examine him, and the remains land in secure storage at the Burke Museum at the University of Washington, neither buried nor displayed, just held, while the argument over who he actually was keeps running in courtrooms 2 decades after he was first found. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. Chatters's caucasoid label described skull shape. It never should have been read as a claim about European ancestry. Later, more careful dental analysis using a method called sun-to-daunt classification put the skull at a 94% likelihood of grouping with the Ainu of Japan and Polynesian populations rather than Europeans, and craniometric work by University of New Mexico anthropologist Joseph Powell, comparing the skull against Asian and North American population data, confirmed it. That finding left the core question of exact ancestry open, and it proved something else entirely. The shape of ancient American skulls doesn't neatly map onto any modern population's shape, a real, still debated wrinkle in physical anthropology that traces to how much human skull shape has genuinely shifted across 10,000 years of migration and isolation. Nothing more exotic than that. The actual answer came in 2015, when geneticist Eski Willerslev's team finally sequenced a full genome from the remains and published it in the journal Nature. one of the most rigorous scientific publications in the world, the kind that requires other geneticists to check the work before it ever prints. The result was unambiguous. Kennewick Man is genetically Native American, and his closest living relatives are the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, one of the same tribes that had spent nearly 20 years fighting for his return through the courts. On February 18, 2017, the Ancient One was finally reburied at a location tribal leaders chose not to make public, closing a legal and scientific fight that had run for almost exactly 21 years from the day two college students found him in the mud during a boat race. Sit with what actually happened here for a second. It's the strongest case on this entire list because every part of it eventually got explained through the actual scientific process, working exactly the way it's supposed to. An initial read that turned out to be incomplete, a genuinely strange skeletal puzzle that stayed unresolved for years, even after the initial Caucasoid label was corrected, and a DNA test precise enough to finally answer the one question that mattered, whose ancestor he actually was. No vault, no denial, no confession needed. Just 20 years, a federal court, and a genome sequencer that didn't exist with this kind of precision when the skeleton was first pulled out of the riverbank. And it turns out Kennewick Man wasn't even the only ancient skeleton in the Pacific Northwest caught in exactly that fight. A second one, discovered decades earlier and 400 miles south, went through almost the identical legal battle, with almost the identical ending, decided by the same genetics lab, and most people who know the Kennewick Man story in detail have still never heard of it at all. Number 7. The Spirit Cave Mummy. You're exploring a rock alcove in the Great Basin Desert of Nevada, one of dozens of dry caves scattered through that stretch of high desert, and tucked into the back of this particular one you find a man, mummified naturally by the dry desert air, with no embalming or preparation at all, wrapped in a rabbit-skin blanket, resting on woven reed mats, still wearing moccasins on his feet after everything else around him had turned to dust. He'd been in his 40s when he died, and the preservation is good enough, even after everything else nearby has crumbled to dust, that you can still make out details of his face. For decades, researchers assume he's relatively recent, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 years old, a reasonable guess based on the preservation quality and the style of the artifacts buried around him. Then, in the 1990s, updated testing on the textiles and hair samples completely rewrites that number. The real, corrected figure for Spirit Caveman comes in at roughly 10,600 years old, making him one of the oldest naturally mummified human remains ever found anywhere in North America, older than Kennewick Man, older than almost anything else on this list, and older than most people outside Nevada would ever guess. And the timing of what happened next is almost too perfect, because it plays out as a near-exact copy of the Kennewick fight, just one state over and a few years apart. In 1997, the Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe formally requested repatriation of the remains under the same federal law the Columbia Plateau tribes had invoked for Kennewick Man. The request was refused for the same underlying reason: disputed ancestry. No clear scientific link yet established between this specific set of remains and any specific living tribe. The mummy stayed in storage at the Nevada State Museum for years, cataloged but effectively frozen in place, the identical holding pattern Kennewick Man was sitting in at almost exactly the same moment, 400 miles away, in a different state entirely. If you're the kind of person who wants to see how these stories actually get resolved, instead of just left hanging, subscribe, because this one has a real ending, and it's coming up right now. In 2015, the same team, led by geneticist S.K. Willerslev, that had just sequenced Kennewick Man's genome, turned its attention to Spirit Cave. Full genomic sequencing on remains this old is genuinely difficult work. DNA degrades badly over 10,000 years, breaking down into fragments too small for older sequencing methods to piece back together reliably, which is exactly why this question sat unanswered for so long in the first place. But the lab pulled it off. The result was definitive. Spirit Caveman's genome linked directly to the Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe, the same tribe that had been asking for his return since 1997. On November 22, 2016, the remains were formally repatriated, and the tribe reburied him in 2018, nearly 2 decades after their original request, and roughly 78 years after he was first pulled out of that rock alcove by whoever first noticed him back in 1940. Something sits uncomfortably once you know both of these cases back to back, side by side, instead of as two separate stories from two separate states. Two of the oldest, best preserved human skeletons ever found in North America. Two tribes making the same legal request within a year of each other through the same federal repatriation process. Two disputed ancestry refusals for the exact same underlying reason. And two identical endings, only reachable once genetic sequencing technology finally caught up to the question being asked, decades after either set of remains was first discovered. Kennewick Man got a documentary and a Smithsonian Magazine cover story. Spirit Cave barely registers outside Nevada, even though it's older and got resolved by the identical process, the same genetics lab, a few years apart. Which raises the obvious question neither case is really built to answer on its own. If two of the highest profile ancient American remains both needed a federal lawsuit and 2 decades of waiting before DNA technology could catch up and settle who they were, how many quieter, less publicized sets of remains are still sitting in storage somewhere right now, with no lawsuit, no news coverage, no household name, and no timeline for anyone to ever run that same test on them? That's a documented, real question raised directly by these two cases, and the next case on this list is exactly the kind of remains that question is actually about. Number 8. Lovelock Cave. Long before any American miner ever set foot in it, the Northern Paiute told a story about a cave in the Nevada desert. According to their oral tradition, a red-haired, unusually tall people called the Sitka, 2-leaders, had once lived alongside them and turned hostile. After years of conflict, Paiute warriors cornered the last of them inside a cave, piled brush at the entrance, and burned them out for good. That story was passed down for generations, sung and retold in Paiute communities across the Great Basin, long before anyone found a single physical bone to go with it. Then, in 1911, guano miners James Hart and David Pugh started digging out bat droppings from a cave near Lovelock, Nevada. Guano was a real commodity at the time, valuable as fertilizer and as a raw material for gunpowder, and cave deposits like this one were worth genuine money to whoever could haul enough of it out. Their shovels hit something under 3 to 6 feet of packed guano, mummified human remains, and thousands of woven artifacts, sitting right beneath the layer they'd been paid to dig through. It took an entire year for word of the find to travel from a guano mine to an academic institution, all the way into 1912, which means an unknown amount of material had already been shoveled out, sold off to collectors, or simply lost before a single trained archaeologist ever got a look at the site. Once word did get out to actual academic institutions, the University of California sent archaeologist Llewellyn Loud to excavate properly, and he spent from April through August of 1912 pulling roughly 10,000 specimens out of the cave across 41 separate excavation lots, working in guano dust and cramped tunnels the entire season. Archaeologist Mark Harrington came back for a second, more careful pass in 1924, going over ground. Loud had already worked, and finding material the first dig had missed entirely. Between them, the two excavations produced one of the largest troves of well-preserved organic artifacts ever recovered from a single site in North America. Woven baskets still intact after thousands of years, duck decoys built from reeds and feathers so far ahead of any written record of the technique that they rewrote assumptions about how early that kind of craftsmanship existed on the continent. Textiles, tools, and yes, human remains, all preserved by exactly the same dry guano that had almost buried the site from history entirely. But this is where the legend and the actual archaeology split apart, and it isn't even close. Neither Loud's 1912 excavation notes, nor Harrington's 1924 follow-up, describe a single giant skeleton coming out of that cave. Nothing in the university's own records supports the Sitka as an unusually tall, physically distinct population. Some of the hair recovered from the site does show a reddish tint, and it's real, it's documented, and it's exactly the kind of detail that would fuel a legend about a red-haired people. But researchers have a straightforward, non-mysterious explanation for it. Hair pigment naturally degrades and oxidizes over centuries buried in mineral-rich cave sediment, shifting darker hair toward a reddish-brown tone regardless of what color it started as in life. It's the same chemical process that turns other buried organic material a similar rust color over enough time. And it shows researchers have tested that explanation enough times elsewhere by now that it genuinely isn't in dispute anymore. The part that's genuinely, honestly unresolved, though, has nothing to do with giants at all. Loud never assembled a single, complete final report, cataloging everything the 1912 dig recovered, unlike Cyrus Thomas's tightly organized 700-page mound survey from a few decades earlier. What exists instead is scattered across field correspondence and individual lot notes, some of it still sitting uncombined in archive boxes more than a century later, waiting for someone to finally cross-reference all 41 lots against each other in one place. That's an ordinary archival gap, the kind that shows up whenever a dig moves faster than the people documenting it, left by a massive, fast-moving excavation that genuinely outpaced the paperwork of its era. But it does mean nobody today can produce one clean, comprehensive account of exactly what came out of Lovelock Cave and where every piece of it ended up, and that gap is exactly the kind of space a legend about giants can keep living in indefinitely, unchallenged, because the paperwork that would settle it once and for all was never fully written down in the first place. While that particular legend swallowed all the attention for over a century, a much quieter, far better documented skull mystery was sitting in plain sight the entire time, on the other side of the country, inside mounds that reel. Credentialed scientists had already measured in careful, peer-reviewed detail. Number 9. The Adena Coneheads. You're archaeologist William Mills, and you're excavating the Adena Mound just outside Chillicothe, Ohio, the burial site that will eventually give an entire prehistoric culture its name. Inside, you recover somewhere between 33 and 36 skeletons, laid out across the mound's burial chambers in the same careful arrangement archaeologists find at other Adena sites across the region, along with an extraordinary carved stone pipe shaped like a human figure, a piece so distinctive and so well made that it becomes one of the defining artifacts of the whole Adena culture, reproduced in textbooks for over a century afterward. Nothing about the count or the artifacts looks unusual on its own, and Mills's own report describes the burials in plain, ordinary terms. What's unusual is what happens when later researchers go back decades afterward, working with a different Adena burial population entirely, and actually measure the skulls in careful, controlled detail. The Adena culture flourished across the Ohio Valley and into West Virginia and Kentucky from roughly 1400 BCE to 300 CE, a run of nearly 2,000 years, and its people built the mounds this entire list keeps circling back to, mound after mound after mound, spread across a territory larger than most modern countries. Peer-reviewed physical anthropology work on one specific Adena burial population, the Wright Mounds, found something genuinely remarkable. Roughly 89% of the adult males and 92% of the adult females studied were brachycephalic, meaning short, wide-headed, and high-vaulted, to a degree researchers describe, in print, as the highest skull vaults reported anywhere in the world, a specific, peer-reviewed finding about one population buried in the Ohio Valley, not a rough estimate or a rounded-up guess. You can look up the paper yourself. It's sitting in the physical anthropology literature under its own name, published and citable like any other finding in the field. Part of that elevation comes from genuine genetic and developmental traits within the Adena population itself, the kind that show up in a community's skeletal record, generation after generation, passed down the way any physical trait gets passed through a population over dozens of generations. Part of it comes from artificial occipital flattening, the same category of intentional infant head shaping you already heard about with the Paracas skulls 2 cases ago, just producing a rounder, higher result here instead of an elongated one. Different technique, different visual result, same underlying idea. Reshape the skull deliberately while the bone is still soft enough to move. This is where some popular internet write-ups get it wrong. They've taken Mills's real 1901 excavation and attached a giant, or non-human framing to it, that the actual peer-reviewed record simply does not support, and never has. The primary excavation report describes ordinary range human skeletons, measured the same careful way Norris and Thomas measured theirs decades earlier. What actually measures as extreme is the skull shape itself, documented, measured, and formally published in the scientific literature, not speculated by someone repeating a second-hand claim online. That distinction matters for this whole list. The Adena skull data doesn't need an alien gloss to be genuinely strange. The highest skull vaults reported anywhere in the world is already a remarkable, citable, peer-reviewed claim about real human beings who lived, farmed, built mounds, and were buried in the Ohio Valley over a span of nearly 2,000 years. Slapping a non-human origin onto that fact doesn't make it more interesting. If anything, it makes it easier to dismiss entirely, because now a skeptical viewer can point at the unsupported giant or non-human claim, throw out the whole case as internet nonsense, and never learn the part that was actually true, actually peer-reviewed, and actually documented the entire time it was sitting in plain academic view. This same pattern shows up in almost every case on this list so far, from the Smithsonian's own field measurements to the Paracas skulls to this one. The real, verifiable detail usually holds your attention fine on its own, without any extra help. The giant claim, the alien claim, the non-human DNA claim, those get piled on afterward, and they hand a skeptical viewer an easy excuse to write off the whole case, real evidence included. The last case on this list doesn't need any of that piled on top. It's the one item where the institution itself, on the record, in its own words, already confirmed the thing the entire locked-away premise of this video has been building toward from the first minute. Number 10. The Bone Doctors Collection. You're a reporter on a Washington Post investigative team, and you've just finished cross-referencing decades of Smithsonian acquisition records against a single curator's career, pulling ledgers and shipping manifests that hadn't been read together in this kind of detail in over a century. The number that comes out of it is almost impossible to hold in your head at once. The Smithsonian Institution currently holds at least 30,700 human bones and body parts, not artifacts, not replicas, actual human remains, including more than 250 human brains, sitting in storage right now, most of them never displayed to the public and never itemized in any list you or I could actually request to see, no matter how many forms we filled out. Most of that collection traces back to one man, Ailes Hrdlicka, a Smithsonian curator who began building it in 1903 and kept building it for decades, with the full institutional backing of the museum behind him the entire time. He traveled internationally to build it, pulling remains from Kodiak Island in Alaska, from communities in South Africa, and from the Philippines, assembling one of the largest privately curated human remains networks any single researcher has ever built inside a national museum. His stated purpose was to advance a racial hierarchy theory of human classification, the idea that skeletal measurements could rank human populations against each other, a theory mainstream science has since completely rejected as false and scientifically baseless. To build his collection, Hrdlicka didn't limit himself to old battlefield remains or donated specimens. In the 1930s, he personally oversaw the exhumation of roughly 1,000 indigenous graves on Kodiak Island, Alaska, largely without the consent of the descendants whose relatives were being dug out of the ground and shipped east. The detail that turns this from an old scandal into a live one comes from a separate ProPublica investigation. Built off years of tracking repatriation data across the entire American museum system, it found the Smithsonian holds roughly 10,000 sets of human remains today, more than any other museum in the United States, by a wide margin. And because of a specific legal technicality, the Smithsonian falls under the National Museum of the American Indian Act, rather than the standard federal repatriation law that governs every other American museum and forces them to publish detailed inventories. It is not required to publicly itemize its holdings the same way those other institutions legally have to. Other museums have to show their work, list by list, in databases the public can search. That legal gap around the Smithsonian is still open today, years after the story broke. So when people say the Smithsonian is hiding something, they're usually pointing at the wrong evidence. An invented Egyptian vault, a giant nobody can produce a bone from, a rumor with no paper trail attached to it at all. But the real version of that claim was sitting in the Smithsonian's own acquisition ledgers this entire time, confirmed by its own current leadership, who commissioned task forces and began active repatriation efforts only after reporters forced the number into daylight in 2023. 30,700 bones and body parts, 250 brains. One curator's now fully discredited theory, carried out with the institution's own backing for decades, and a legal loophole that, to this day, still keeps the full list out of public view, years after the world found out it existed. None of these 10 cases prove aliens walked among us, and most of them don't even prove what the loudest internet version of the story claims once you actually trace it back to a real source, an actual newspaper, an actual excavation report, an actual peer-reviewed paper. Institutions built to preserve the past don't always show you everything they're holding, and the reasons are almost always human: ordinary bureaucracy, ego, or a legal gap nobody in Washington has bothered to close. So tell me where in the world you're watching this from, and subscribe for more of these while you're at it.